Hello. Now we're in business. Welcome, everyone. I hope you've all got a drink in your hands and are sitting comfortably. Thank you for being here tonight. My name is Whelan. I'm the co-convener of the Battle of Ideas Festival, which happened a few weeks ago over in Church House, and also the commissioning editor of These Things, Letters on Liberty, which was a project that the Academy of Ideas started in lockdown out of utter frustration at the closing down of the public square and any kind of public debate, and has continued on. I think we've got 33 or something now, and call it intuition or something. We asked, feeling that something was going to happen in the world of smoking bans and clampdowns on freedoms and public health, we asked Simon Clarke to write this letter on liberty on not just against bans, not just about the current moment, but about the idea of why freedom might be associated with smoking. Why this thing, whether you call it a dirty habit, a lovely habit, something that you just do after a stressful day, would be linked to something as important as liberty, choice, agency, autonomy, all these big words and big ideas. And of course, very shortly after we started having conversations about this essay, we got the best and worst publicity move from the Prime Minister, who has not just suggested, I think, pretty concretely promised now that there will be some form of sequential ban on smoking, raising the age limit bit by bit, so that you might have ludicrous situation in the future in which a younger age group can't smoke while their grandparents can. And I'm sort of thinking about how I first started smoking, nicking my uncle's fags. I think that will become a lot more necessary if the current plans go ahead. But the idea of freedom and smoking, or freedom and any kind of sort of personal choice that is against the norm, is not a new one, and it's also not going to be one that's just related to smoking. I mean, thinking about some of the discussions around obesity, alcohol, the list is endless about what is bad for you, what could kill you, what should be banned in your best interests. So tonight, Simon and Forest, which is the freedom organisation for the right to enjoy smoking tobacco, who, thank you very much to Simon and Forest for paying for your drinks. If we can get a round of applause or a thanks. Decided to come to the heart of Westminster to get in amongst it, and very few people are listening, at least in the palaces of Westminster. Outside of it, in rooms like this, there are lots of people who do care, smokers and non-smokers, about freedom and about what it might say if we as a society agree to such kind of paternalistic attacks on our ability to make choices ourselves. Now, you might think this is, and I hope you will feel free to say what you think about this, and you might think it's a foregone conclusion that anyone who comes to a Forest event might be pro-smoking. It's a bit like asking if there's any butchers in the house at a vegan meetup. But this is a discussion, so please feel free to raise any issues. There are lots of sort of questions that I tussle with, even as someone who's, I think I'm pretty sure what I know about the smoking ban, around things like, whether or not there does need to be, if it's true that links are so clear as anti-smoking public health types argue about this particular pursuit and health outcomes, should we do something? Is there some kind of middle ground? Or I'm basically saying, let's get into it, let's try and tussle with it. So what's going to happen this evening is that Simon, I'm going to introduce everybody, we're going to have some opening speeches, and then we're going to go out to you for an open discussion, and we'll go sort of ping pong to and fro from you guys and the panelists. So let me introduce the illustrious lot here sat in this lovely rooms at Unheard. The first who's going to speak is Simon Clarke, who is the author of Freedom Up in Smoke. Simon of LSE. She's currently the Communications Officer at the Institute of Economic Affairs. And Reem, as you'll know her very well, her face has been all over television. She's been on radio, BBC, LBC, GB News, you name it, Talk TV. She's also written for CapEx, ConservativeHome and The Telegraph, and she's got a particular interest in tobacco harm reduction when she recently co-authored a short IEA paper, which I urge you all to look up, called A Vapid Solution, Why Banning Disposable E-Cigarettes Would Be a Failure of Law Enforcement. Sat next to, on the right of Reem there, is Henry Hill. Henry is the Deputy Editor of ConservativeHome. Welcome, Henry. Prior to that, he was the Assistant Editor, and before that, the News Editor. And he's written for The Daily Telegraph, The Spectator, Unheard, CapEx, and The Critic, among others. And he's a frequent commentator on radio and television. And then last but not least, sat next to me here is Claire Fox, the Director of the Academy of Ideas. Welcome, Claire. Claire runs the Battle of Ideas Festival, which you should all look up. She's, over her political career, founded and initiated a number of very important freedom-loving projects, including things like Debating Matters, which is a sixth form debating competition, and has now recently gone into prisons in a really exciting and challenging and unique way. The Academy, which is a residential summer school for freedom fighters, which you should all collar Claire and talk to her about afterwards. And things like Living Freedom, a project for young people, and the Academy of Ideas, which she's the director of, we were just over the road, publishes the Letters on Liberties that you should all have a copy of in your hand. She was formerly an MEP for the North West, now member of the House of Lords as Baroness Fox of Buckley, and she's the author of the recently published book, I Still Find That Offensive. So can we welcome our panel, please? Simon, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Ella. And I'm very proud to have had quite a long association with the Battle of Ideas. I remember going to the very first one back in, I think it was 2005. And the following year, Claire asked me if I would just give it a bit of a plug. And I wrote, the Battle of Ideas is a breath of fresh air. Freedom of speech is actively encouraged, which is hugely liberating. Audience and speakers are refreshingly candid. Apart from speaking their minds, many of them enjoy a drink, others like to smoke. This is the real world, not the grey, bland, sanitised world our political masters would like us to inhabit. And I wrote that back in 2006, and I could equally have written it a few weeks ago when the Battle of Ideas took place at the end of October. Now, Ella mentioned I'm a non-smoker. I'm a non-smoker who defends smokers and smoking. And I have to say, I sometimes feel a bit of an imposter. So why do I do it? Well, in my view, smoking is a bellwether for liberty, and the war on smoking should be of interest to anyone who cares about individual freedom. Because what's happening to smokers today is just part of a much broader attack on people's lifestyles, whether it be smoking, eating or drinking, or indeed matters such as freedom of speech. Now, increasingly, lifestyles, habits and opinions that are not approved by government or other elites are being demonised or worse, prohibited. Now, smokers, for example, are routinely depicted as being hopelessly addicted to a dirty, disgusting habit that is driving them into poverty and a guaranteed early grave. But I believe strongly, however, that to maintain a free society, you have to defend liberties that you yourself may not enjoy or even approve of, because eventually some small liberty that you enjoy or take for granted may be taken away from you as well. Now, I believe the war on smoking is actually a war on pleasure. I know some smokers want to quit and others want to cut down. Some may even wish they'd never started. Millions, however, do enjoy smoking and they don't want to give up. And why should they? As long as they are not harming other people, it's none of our business whether or not they smoke. We live in a free country, allegedly, and if adults choose to smoke, that's a matter for them and nobody else. We're not allowed to mention it these days, but smoking, despite the well-known health risks, is actually a source of pleasure and comfort to a great many people. Now, I've always known this because although I don't smoke, I've known many, many people who do or did, and I've always been impressed by how many of them enjoyed it. Even those who have quit for health or other reasons They often say to me how much pleasure they got from smoking and how much they miss it now they've given up. Now, a few years ago, Forest decided to test this anecdotal evidence, and we commissioned a study of 600 confirmed smokers. And it was conducted by an independent research group called the Centre for Substance Use Research. The results were interesting because they revealed that the overwhelming majority of respondents, over 95%, gave pleasure as their primary reason for smoking. Most important, they knew the health risks, but as far as they were concerned, the pleasure of smoking outweighed those risks. Now, the idea that smokers need the state to help them to quit is, I believe, ill-judged and wrong. Millions of people have quit smoking, some overnight. It can be difficult for some smokers to break the habit, but it's far from impossible, and the evidence is there for all to see. In the last decade alone, millions of smokers have switched voluntarily to safer nicotine products, such as e-cigarettes, without the intervention of the state. Now, as well as being a war on pleasure, I think the war on smoking is also a war on the working class. Now, I come from a comfortable middle-class background, so it's probably not my place to say this. But listen to the words of former Labour Health Secretary John Reid, who was the last Labour Health Secretary in the Tony Blair government. A former heavy smoker, Reid represented some of the poorest, one of the poorest constituencies in the country, in Glasgow. And he understood why many people smoke. In 2004, when anti-smoking campaigners were demanding a ban on smoking in all enclosed public places, including every working men's club in the country, Reid resisted calls for a blanket ban on smoking indoors. He even gave a speech in which he said that for a young single mother living on a sink estate, a cigarette might be one of the few pleasures she had. Now, naturally, the middle-class do-gooders in the public health industry came down on him like a ton of bricks. But given John Reid's background and the constituency he represented, I'd take his word ahead of theirs any day. Today, smoking, obesity and alcohol are frequently mentioned in the context of levelling up. And there seems to be an unchallenged consensus that tackling all three should be part of that process. But I don't see it that way at all. For me, reducing smoking rates by forcing people to quit isn't levelling up, it's dumbing down, because it treats smokers, the majority of whom are from lower socio-economic groups, as if they're stupid, uneducated idiots for choosing to smoke in the first place. Now, in my view, instead of insulting people's intelligence and curtailing their freedoms with further restrictions on the sale of tobacco and where you can light up, government should concentrate instead on creating the conditions for them to make so-called healthier choices for themselves. Because it's clear that while many people smoke for pleasure, many also smoke to relieve some of the stress that may be caused by their circumstances or their environment. In other words, instead of punishing adults who smoke with punitive taxation and other measures designed to force them to quit, often against their will, government should focus on the underlying reasons why a greater proportion of people from lower socio-economic backgrounds are smokers in the first place. Now, it may take substantially longer to achieve the government's ludicrous smoke-free target, but that's a small price to pay if, in the meantime, ministers are addressing far more important issues like housing, jobs and poverty. That, to me, is the essence of levelling up, improving people's lives not through coercion and prohibition, but by tackling some of the factors that lead us to eat, drink and smoke to excess. But that said, if people still choose to smoke because they want to, whether it's for pleasure or any other reason, that decision must be respected because freedom of choice and personal responsibility are paramount. Without them, we no longer live in a free society. And as somebody who's never been a member of the Conservative Party, but has generally voted Conservative all my life, I think it's absolutely outrageous that the Conservative Party has abandoned the two major principles that I always thought the Conservative Party stood for, which is freedom of choice and personal responsibility. So that brings us to Rishi Sunak's ban on the sale of tobacco to future generations of adults, which he announced at the Conservative conference in Manchester in October. First of all, it won't stop people smoking. That much is absolutely certain. 1 in 5 cigarettes currently smoked in the UK is illicit, and 73% of smokers have bought illicit tobacco at some time or another. If the sale of tobacco is banned to future generations of adults, it will simply drive even more smokers into the arms of well-organised criminal gangs. Now, aside from the boost it will give black marketeers, raising the age of sale of tobacco by 1 year every year is also going to infantilise future generations of law-abiding adults who will be denied the opportunity to think for themselves and make their own choices about their lifestyle. Put simply, it will deny them autonomy over their own bodies. Now, I don't smoke, but I am substantially overweight, as you can tell. Now, I know I should lose weight, but I don't want the government forcing me to lose weight, and that's the difference. I know the risks I'm taking. My doctor has made that very clear to me on many occasions. But it's my life, no one else's. By all means, educate us about the health risks of smoking or drinking and eating to excess, or not taking enough exercise. But beyond that, leave us alone. And added to this, why is this policy even being considered? In many parts of the world, the sale of tobacco has been in long-term decline. In the UK, smoking rates in all age groups are at their lowest recorded levels. So why ban the sale of cigarettes to future generations now? It just doesn't make sense. Over the next few decades, cigarettes will almost certainly be made obsolete by safer nicotine delivery systems like e-cigarettes or other smokeless products such as heated tobacco and nicotine pouches. But in a free society, let individuals and the market decide the fate of tobacco. Life is not risk-free, and as long as we don't harm other people, we should be permitted to take risks. Smoking falls into that category. I'm an adult. I don't want to be treated like a child. I want to make my own decisions, and I hope you do too. And if you enjoy drinking, smoking, vaping, or eating whatever you damn please, remember this: there is no appeasing the public health lobby. They have no interest in choice or personal responsibility. It's all about control. And does anyone really believe they will settle for a guideline of 14 units of alcohol per week, or a smoke-free nation that allows 5% of adults to light up without further harassment or censure, with millions allowed to vape in peace? It won't surprise you to know that there have already been articles arguing that Rishi Sunak's generational ban doesn't go far enough. These people are simply never happy. And I have absolutely no doubt that when the farcical nature of the policy becomes apparent, where, for example, a 35-year-old will be prohibited from buying cigarettes, but a 36-year-old will be allowed to buy cigarettes, and it'll be a complete joke, even anti-smoking activists will hold up their hands and agree that it isn't working. But at that point, far from repealing the incremental ban, I expect them to demand a ban on the sale of tobacco to all adults, regardless of age. That's what's going to happen. So to conclude, I just want to say that in Rishi Sunak's brave new smoke-free world, which Labour, of course, supports, so we have the bizarre situation of a Conservative Prime Minister almost certainly relying on Labour votes to get this legislation through Parliament. Smoking may be eradicated, but it won't stop there. All nicotine products, including e-cigarettes, will be next. Our consumption of alcohol will come under even greater scrutiny, and we will eat not for pleasure, but to live as long as we can. Never mind that in our grand old age, most of us won't have the money to enjoy it. Plus, as we live longer, the chances of getting some form of cancer, regardless of our lifestyle, will inevitably increase. Ladies and gentlemen, I believe life is about living, and if that includes taking risks with our own health and bodies, that is our choice. Thank you.
Fantastic, Simon. That's really great. Thank you for kicking us off with that. Reem, I want to come straight to you because you are the generation who Sunak is acting on behalf of. I mean, I know that you've had your own journey with cigarettes and tobacco, and maybe you want to say a little bit about that, but does this, I mean, are young people behind this? Is there some kind of petition I've missed? I mean, Speak for your generation.
Well, it's funny you say that. I would like to sit here and say that everybody in my generation is a bunch of freedom lovers, but unfortunately I don't think that's the case at all. And I think that it's really about making those arguments for individual liberty. Now, I can sit here and talk about harm reduction, which is something I'm particularly interested in as well. I've got my nicotine pouches here, which I personally love. I'm not going to demonstrate it now. Last time I was on a panel with Simon, he forced me to demonstrate it, and I do look a bit like Mickey Mouse with that in. But what I will say is that when we're looking at other countries across the world that have been able to effectively achieve a smoke-free country, take Sweden, for example, their population of smokers are about less than 5%. They've been able to achieve effectively a smoke-free society, not by banning cigarettes, not by making it the worst country in Europe to smoke tobacco, which the UK is, by the way. What they have done is they've allowed adults to make healthier choices and encourage those adults to make choices that are better. They've actually very recently looked at legislation to reduce the tax on non-tobacco products like nicotine pouches, which are significantly safer and significantly healthier for your health. And so I think when we're looking at countries like Sweden, which have been able to achieve that smoke-free figure, they've done so without taking away those choices from adults. What we've done in the United Kingdom, what we're about to do, is effectively treating the adults of the future as though they will be children forever, as though they will never be able to make those fundamental choices for their own lifestyles. And so, as much as I believe in harm reduction, I believe that that is the way forward. The public health lobby will never stop, and we've always been sort of in alignment with them and sort of talking about the way in which we can have a better society, have a healthier society. But actually, I think we've got to stop there and start making the arguments for freedom, start making the arguments for individual liberty, and start making the arguments for choice. Because ultimately, what this legislation will do, what the Tobacco and Vapes Bill will do, is treat the adults of the future as though they cannot make those decisions, as though they will be children forever. And I think that's immoral.
Brilliant, thank you. Henry, I mean, pick up on anything you like that Simon's raised, but in particular, I'm struck by his challenge to the Conservative Party or Conservatives that this seems to be an antithesis of what the ideology is meant to be about, but also that there's, I can't imagine that there's been any real kind of groundswell among Conservatives for this kind of move, or maybe actually I'm wrong and the outlook on public health has changed and we're not not a nation of freedom lovers anymore.
I mean, we're not, and I'm not entirely sure that we ever were, in fairness. The great liberty-loving British yeoman is a bit of a myth. My favourite bit of polling ever was from 2011, after 2 days of not bad but not terrible riots, when YouGov found 1/3 of voters wanted live ammunition used on protesters. And that was the only thing that didn't have 50% support: tear gas, baton rounds, everything else, more north of 50% after 2 days. And generally speaking, if you look at British attitudes on most stuff, it's not libertarian at all. After lockdown, there was, 15% of people wanted nightclubs to stay shut forever, just because. And that's really the policy environment you're working with. So I think I used to go to Smoke on the Water, and I'm used to kind of every year going to something like this and, talking about the importance of freedom and all the rest of it. And it's just an absolute, that on that basis, it's a losing cause. Because politically speaking, it's not even logical, because the argument I used to make is that we've sort of switched from having a social safety net to a social straitjacket, right? Because we've now got a welfare state where in order to save it money, we crack down on people. But when you deal with stuff like tobacco bans, that's not even the case. Because if you actually did manage to stamp out smoking, you would cost the NHS a vast amount of money. Because there's no such thing as a preventable death. Everyone dies of something. And the main thing that's a massive drag on public finances is social care and end-of-life care, which is people taking ages to die of, whatever it is you get at 85, right? I'm not looking forward to that. And I'm going to be forced to get there. So I think actually...
Into very dark territory.
Yeah, well, sorry. I've done a lot of these. There's only so many upbeat speeches about freedom you can give. But actually,
I'm still there.
But I think actually to pivot a little bit, last time I did one of these, and I'm slightly surprised that Simon invited me back. Last time I did one of these, I said that actually for the average smoker, the ban would probably be a good thing. And I'm going to say that again, because given the terrible policy environment, what's important if you actually want to smoke is private resistance. And What this will do is make the black market bigger. And the black market is already, frankly, for the savvy smoker who takes the time to work out where they're buying, better. I left my prop at the back of the room. Unfortunately, it's in my coat pocket. But I smoke Jarums. They're Indonesian clove cigarettes. They cost me $11 every 200. They're flavoured. They come in non-patronising packaging. And it is in every way a superior... And it's like 1 in 5 cigarette sales are a black market. Only 1 in 5? Why? You pay wildly over the odds to get patronised by the pack, and you're not allowed menthols, and you're not allowed anything else. So I think smoking's not going to get wiped out, right? It's not like none of us are old enough to remember cocaine after they banned that, right? When you ban things, you just create black market mechanisms for it, and obviously that has huge negative costs in terms of organised crime and everything else. And I think the government is ridiculous in completely ignoring that. Yeah. But you can't make it the freedom-based argument. You just have to look at the British electorate. You can find other arguments maybe, but the British public love banning stuff. They love banning stuff, and there's nothing much you can do about it.
Okay. Okay. Claire, maybe that's I'm bristling because I don't want that to be true. But so Claire, maybe you could say something about whether we should sort of give up, I think it's fair to say, Henry.
No.
You're sort of arguing.
No, go and find yourself a decent black market dealer and smoke what you want.
Well, give up on the public political argument for freedom, and anything else maybe you want to say. I know that when I film Claire's Inside the Lords, and anytime we're inside the Lords and want to have a cigarette, we don't just, it's not just the fact that it's very difficult, it's sort of like the House of Lords is forcing us to exercise by walking through 7 different corridors to find this really ugly little shed that people are forced to smoke in anymore. So anything you want to say about that, Claire?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, the issue that Henry raises about whether the British public supports freedom has got nothing to do with smoking. That's just if you want, that's a kind of trivial aspect of a much bigger problem. And it's a problem, that's why do we have a festival called the Battle of Ideas? Because I think that we've got to try and win it, not give in to it. And if it's the case that the majority of people don't support freedom, that's a disaster, because I'm a Democrat and I support freedom, and I've got to win a few arguments. Because it won't be, smoking will be the least of our problems, right? And indeed, it is, in that sense. And it's always a bit embarrassing talking about smoking, even in the Lords. You feel like, do I want to really kind of stake my whole political career on justifying a habit? You know what I mean? It feels like a bit odd. But I think, just to take a little step back on what Rishi Sunak's done, I mean, this was his big health initiative that was kind of the fight against cancer. I mean, you think I'm being trivial, worrying about smoking. I mean, this was particularly trivial, that this was his solution to the big NHS, this is what's going to improve things. When you think about the state of cancer care, particularly after lockdown, what needs to be done in relation to cancer, if this was it was pretty shoddy and pretty poor, if it was his solution. The other thing is, it does drive me mad, that, so forget the freedom thing, that they link this with levelling up, right, and so on and so forth, because it's paternalistic nonsense, right? Actually, the other one that you didn't mention, apart from obesity and drinking, is gambling, which they're also going in heavy on. And what they always say is the poor need to be saved from themselves. But when you look at how they say, I mean, apart from the patronising nature of that, when you look at what's happening, is you actually have got both Labour and the Conservatives encouraging social housing, for example, to ban people smoking in their own home. And you kind of lose sense of it being anything to do with health in the end. Do you know what I mean? And because it's also, they're always trying to do too. But there's also something about, I thought that this new project is the shopkeepers. I can't get over that. I mean, it's hard enough if you're on the local shop on the tills, right? Telling a 17-year-old they can't buy alcohol. At some point in the future, you'll have to tell a 34-year-old, right, that he's not able to buy cigarettes, but the 35-year-old, I mean, what on earth's going to happen there, right? I mean, there's going to be fights in there. I mean, it's going to drive everyone mad. Imagine transition to that. The whole thing is absolutely bonkers at that level. And then I suppose that's another thing that's got nothing to do with freedom, which makes this policy mad, is there's no evidence for it. Now, I'm not the kind of person who goes, evidence, evidence, evidence. They are. But they always say you have to have evidence-based policies. The reason why there's no evidence, because nobody's tried it anywhere, this age thing, And therefore, we don't know what's going to happen. And I think that Henry's absolutely right. What will happen, inevitably, is that we will get round it. It's a massive back market likely to emerge. I mean, it's just not going to work. He'll think it's a win. Whereas I'm a goody two-shoes and don't want a black market because I don't mind going to the shop and just paying me money. There's only the final thing to say, or the things that are difficult for us. I find this difficult. I spoke at the banning smoking indoors question, when Forrest, I can't remember who else was on, but anyway, it was a big dinner. And I spoke at that, whenever that was, and obviously smoking got banned indoors, and I've got used to it now. So there are changes that happen in one's lifetime.
Savoy.
He was at the Savoy. He remembers the Savoy bit. The Savoy. It was a very nice occasion, but absolutely... Oh, with Andrew Neil. Yeah, it was me and Andrew Neil. Anyway, very nice occasion. Obviously, we lost badly. And there is now no smoking indoors. And, of course, if anyone lit up now, I'd be horrified. You know what I mean? So I do realise that things change and that you get used to certain things. And I do think there's an element of which people just get used to the idea that people aren't smoking, which is one of the reasons why I think so many young people just don't bother smoking, right? They're just not, it's just not a fashionable thing to do anymore. I think this will make it illicit, more attractive and, glamorous because they're making a big fuss about it. I'm not particularly interested in encouraging people to smoke. I mean, it's a personal habit. I don't want to go on a campaign. You can do it if you want. The other thing is, just the final thing is, on the Lords, when I was speaking in the King's Speech section, I was there. It was a serious discussion. I wanted to talk about, the new media bill, the rise of anti-Semitism, the way the BBC and the mainstream media, I think, have completely compromised on the issue. I'm having all this, right? And everyone's, it's kind of, you get your chance to make your... And all the front bench, Conservative, Labour and Lib Dem, on these big themes, started off saying, before we get onto the serious stuff, we'd just like to say the smoking proposals put forward by Rishi Sunak do not go far enough. And he's completely sold out on vaping. All flavoured vaping should be banned. These are... Now, I'm trying to give up smoking. The freedom-loving crowd that you are will appreciate my bloody choice on this question. I'm a grown-up and allowed to do what I want. As a consequence, I'm using disposable vapes, which I have to say I wasn't enthusiastic about at the beginning. My favourite flavour is banana and strawberry, and I experiment with a range of banana strawberry type flavours, i.e. the very flavours which everybody in government seems to believe are designed for children. So the irony of all this is the one time in the world that actually I want to be treated like an infant. I want them to leave me alone so that I have my lovely flavoured vapes, so it might help me give up smoking, and they're going to take them away from me. I can tell, it's just not fair.
So let's head out to the floor. If you could just show me hands, I'm going to come and give you a microphone. So if we go back here. Go ahead.
Hi, I'm Connor from the Taxpayers Alliance. So it's a big public health argument on the banning of smoking. Will banning smoking save the NHS money, or will it cost the NHS money?
Hi, I'm Olivia Lever and I'm the director of Blue Beyond, and we are a movement for young Conservatives that struggles to access Westminster or feel disconnected from policy making because they simply can't access it due to a number of barriers, financial, social or educational. We recently polled our members on what they actually think of the current state of the Conservative Party, and 30% of those surveyed said that they are for abolishing sin taxes such as sugar tax, smoking, alcohol, all that lovely juicy stuff that we love in here. And when we polled, a lot of the time it did come up that they were really angry about the smoking ban and that they weren't happy with the infantilisation. How do you think the actual policy is going to shift from this infantilisation of young people. It's not happening under Labour, it's not happening under the Tories. What do you think is actually going to be that turning moment in our political climate to shift away from infantilising young people?
Hi, Martin Cullip, long-time Forest fan, currently with Taxpayers Protection Alliance, Washington, DC. I'd just like to float the idea that perhaps you're all misunderstanding what Rishi Sunak's doing here. Politicians for years have suffered with giving money to lobbying organisations which then lobby the government policies, and that irritates them. So Rishi Sunak's got a cunning plan that if he just caves into them before they lobby the politicians, it saves them a lot of stress.
Very good.
Have we got any other brilliant comments here? Yeah, go ahead.
Devil's advocate, but was it wrong to ban heroin and crack cocaine?
Okay, thank you.
Awesome.
And over here, go ahead.
Hello, I work for Caroline Johnson, who, as some of you may know, is the person who's trying to ban disposable vapes at the moment. I don't want to talk about that tonight, though. Sort of going off of the very apt question that was answered by the gentleman beforehand, how would you like to extend your views on smoking to other drugs? I was particularly interested by what Simon said about this war on pleasure, the benefits of something that could relieve stress, particular attack on the working class. This all sounds to me like a manifesto for legalising cannabis.
Okay, thanks very much. Pass it back, and we'll take one more here. We'll come back out, so if you... We'll come back to
Yes, last week the generational ban on smoking was declared unconstitutional in Malaysia by the Attorney General. And Malaysia is a third world underdeveloped country where that happened. And the United Kingdom is a Western civilized nation where that should also happen, I think.
Okay, thanks. Okay, panel, let's come back to you just for some quick thoughts. So I want to keep coming out. I mean, some of, the issue, bringing in the issue of drugs and things like that, it sort of makes me think that isn't at the heart of this the idea that people who are pro-ban make the argument, really, it's to me a sort of misanthropic argument, which is that unless we are restricted for our own good, people will naturally go down the excessive bad route. So they will naturally smoke themselves to death, eat themselves to death, or if heroin is available, everyone will end up a heroin addict. Are we just or should we just make a sort of pro-human argument to that? But how does that come into tension with the fact that a lot of these things are addictive? And there are obviously a lot of people who will make the argument that say, well, I can choose lots of things, but I can't choose to put the fags down. I can't choose to stop drinking because I am an addict. So how does that tension work? And anything else you want to pick up on, Simon?
Well, I remember maybe 2 decades ago, the Academy of Ideas had a conference called Freedom and Its Limits. And I think there are limits to freedom. I remember once talking to the Hayek Society at Oxford, and I realised then that I wasn't a libertarian because I was surrounded by all these nutters who wanted to legalise every single drug, including heroin. And I think I wouldn't legalise heroin. I've seen the damage it can do in terms of a friend of mine, his son became a heroin addict and ended up in jail because he was stealing from his own family in order to get the money to maintain his habit. I mean, it was just a shocking situation to be in. Smoking is completely different to that. It's not a mind-altering substance in the same way. It doesn't have the same incredibly damaging effect. So I do think there are limits on freedom. Cannabis, I think one has to be much more open-minded about that. But what I hate is the hypocrisy of many of the people who support the legalisation of cannabis, including MPs, who at the same time are trying to get smoking tobacco banned. I mean, it's absolutely incredible. And of course, these are the same MPs as well. Many of them want to reduce the voting age to 16 at the same time as raising the age of sale of tobacco. So there's an incredible amount of hypocrisy. I don't quite know why tobacco gets the stick that it does. Obviously, there are serious health risks associated with tobacco. But I do think it comes down to it being primarily a working class habit these days, and a lot of the people in the public health sector are from some middle class backgrounds. They no longer smoke. I mean, many of them are ex-smokers, and it's like, you know, forcing the little old lady to cross the road. They're determined to do it, even whether the little old lady doesn't actually want to cross the road. There was another point made earlier, I think it was Olivia at the back. I do think we do need younger generations to speak up, because this legislation is incredibly clever because it doesn't affect any existing smoker. So why should any existing smoker get a head up about something that's never going to affect them? As it happens, I think they're wrong to think that. I think in 10 years' time, all sale of all cigarettes will be banned, so it will eventually affect them down the line. But at the moment, it's not going to affect them. We need more people like Reem here, who I have to say, over the last year that I've known her, has been fantastic in speaking out, because Reem quit smoking, she moved on to vaping, but she's always defended people's right to smoke. And as it happens, I believe she's now relapsed into smoking again. So. But she's only a social smoker. But the point is, we need more people like Reem and the people that Olivia was talking about from her organisation. We need them to come to the party and really sort of speak out, because older smokers are not going to do it. They haven't done much in terms of fighting back against smoking bans over the last 20 years. It has been, you know, a lot of the time we've been banging our heads against a brick wall, trying to get people on board. We have won some victories along the way. It's not been, you know, just one defeat after another. I mean, there are a number of policies that have been suggested over the last 15 years that haven't come to fruition because we've fought really hard to stop them. There was talk, for example, after banning smoking in cars carrying children, that all private vehicles should be included in that ban. So you wouldn't even be able to smoke in your own car, even if you were the only person in that car. There was talk 15 years ago about banning smoking in pub doorways and even beer gardens. Now, that hasn't happened yet. It may well happen over the next few years. And also, there's been a lot of talk about banning smoking in social housing. Now, again, we've been fighting that as hard as we can. So we have won small victories, obviously, in the overall scheme of things. We've been losing one battle after another, but that doesn't mean to say, and I agree with what Claire was saying a bit earlier, we should never, ever give up. As soon as you give up fighting these battles, you simply open the door to further regulations. And this is what gets me so frustrated, and I'll wind up here, gets me so frustrated with a lot of vaping advocates who are happy to throw smokers under the bus, thinking that it'll never happen to them. But don't they realise that as soon as some legislation comes in to do with smokers, as soon as the public health lobby gets its way, they'll be straight on to vaping and vapors next. And it'll actually bring forward the day that vapors themselves will be ostracised in the same way as smokers.
Henry.
So there were a lot of questions, so I'll deal with sort of two, the drugs one and the sort of cultural change one. On drugs, I mean, the big problem with any discussion of drugs is the word drugs, right? Because it describes a vast number of different substances, all of which have different effects, different markets, different sort of secondary effects in terms of criminal supply chain. And it's ridiculous to talk about them in the same breath, really. Like the idea that Class A contains ecstasy and heroin just tells you that Class A is a completely meaningless category with no reference to the things in it. So should you legalise many drugs? Yeah, sure, absolutely. Ecstasy would be better off legal. Cocaine would probably be better off legal. It's different with heroin and opioids, just because of how physiologically addictive they are. It is interesting that actually the public health impact of heroin got a lot worse after it was banned. But I wouldn't advocate legalising heroin because I don't think there is a way to have a sustainable heroin habit that doesn't kill you really quickly. So you can do that, and it is interesting the way that you end up with people who sort of have mentally separated weed from drugs. So they have their view on drugs, which is still very stern, and then there's weed, which is not a drug anymore, it's weed. And so they're having a debate about that, which I think is sort of slightly strange, especially as Simon says, it's utterly bizarre to talk about legalising weed and then banning smoking at the same time. Like, you know, tobacco is in spliffs. You know, otherwise you're just making people take more of it. So sure, these arguments do logically follow to a review of drugs rules. With reference to what I said about the black market, it is worth pointing out that in Canada, where they legalise weed, weed's got a lot more expensive and the police have cracked down on all the old head shops. because now they're in competition with a heavily taxed government product. So be careful what you wish for. If you currently enjoy a relatively reliable, untaxed habit with home delivery from someone on your phone, because the state might not be able to match that. On the cultural change point, yeah, it is deeply frustrating to see the Conservative Party going this way. The reason for it is structural. There's essentially a vast permanent lobby that endlessly hammers people on this stuff. And if you don't have particularly strong personal principle views on it, eventually that's just what you do, especially when things get difficult. It's really easy when you're on the up and you're sort of making the weather. But when things get difficult and you desperately want someone to give you like a good press release or applaud you at a conference, then you go to the Times health thing and you announce some ban and they all clap you. And that's a really powerful kind of way of shaping people. In terms of whether or not that'll change, I don't know. Obviously, it did in the States. Prohibition failed. But I think the thing to remember about the failure of prohibition, this loops back to the idea of getting used to people not smoking indoors. You need to kill the policeman in your head, right? Because they didn't get rid of prohibition by stopping drinking until they got rid of it. They had speakeasies. They had a ridiculously decadent drinking culture, which we still kind of write about, and it's embedded itself in culture. So if you ever want to change this, you need to, this is why I was talking about personal resistance, you need to make sure that you don't allow the boiling frog changing in your own outlook. How many of you allow people to smoke in your own homes if you own them? Like, probably not very many. Change that, right? You would have done 20 years ago. You have to keep that up yourself, and you have to set an example. And that's the only way you can do it, because otherwise you end up with people who have no cultural reference point for any of this, and then they just don't care. And I think that's something that's hard for campaigners like us to realise, is that people who don't share our views or don't share our habits, they just have nothing invested in what will be a very difficult fight.
Reem, sorry, I'm rushing us because I want to get back out, but Reem.
That's really interesting. I want to pick up on a couple of those points. First of all, on the drug stuff, I think that Henry's right. It's very easy to talk about drug legalisation in the same breath as any time anything is banned. But I think we've got to remember, and this comes back to the NHS question, I think, from Connor at the back. The only reason why the government care about your health is because they control your healthcare. And, as long as we have a socialised healthcare system, as long as we have a blanket approach where the government effectively control the type of healthcare you receive, and it means that my lifestyle choices are paid for by other taxpayers, as long as that's the system, the government is still going to continue to control our health. And I think it's really important to make that point, that if we're going to be talking about individuals being free to make their own choices, they should also be free to pay for those choices. And at the moment, the current system does not allow that. I also just want to pick up on the points about the sort of culture and the shift. I do think that young people, and this comes back to the first question, young people are not very pro-freedom, unfortunately, in this country. There was some polling done by the Fraser Institute. 53% of 18 to 34-year-olds believe that socialism is the ideal economic system. Now, it's a huge amount of number, 53%, but also when we're thinking about what socialism actually means as an ideology, it means that they believe that the state, that other people should be controlling our lives, whether that be economic choices, whether that be lifestyle choices, whether that be cultural choices, political choices. Those things should be controlled by other people, by the elite, by the public health lobby, or by those people in government. And I think it's a failure in our part. We should be making the arguments for freedom. This is maybe where I disagree with Henry here. We've got to make the arguments for freedom, because if we don't, then the smoking will be the least of our problems, and they will be taking away other choices and other freedoms.
First of all, I do not think it is shocking that 53% of people say that they support socialism. I can't believe it's so few, actually. But it's such a low amount. But also, socialism is not the same as being interchangeable with the state should run your lives. And I say this as a lefty because, to be honest with you, I really, really am fed up with people on the right who basically, for the last 13 years, have been taking away freedoms, giving lectures to anyone on the left about anything. I mean, it's annoying. This is way beyond left and right. And the reason why young people are anti-freedom is not because they're left-wing, it's because my generation, and the generation under me, to be fair, on the left and right have not fought for freedom because we gave up, right? We haven't fought for freedom with them. And it's the most egregious, and I know that, you know, it is easy to just go, it's all Owen Jones's fault. You know, the most egregious examples of the people that we think of who are anti-freedom are people like Owen or Ash Sarkar, all of the kind of social justice warriors and so on. But the problem is that actually it isn't just a straightforward matter of, oh, those silly left-wingers. It's the fact that every major institution in this country has bought into all this stuff. And we're talking about now a government on the right which had a mandate for political realignment, an 80-seat majority, ends up thinking that the way it should deal with that is by bringing in this generational smoking ban. And just think about that. What a disaster that is, right? And then you go out and you say to a young person, oh, the problem is you're left wing. Oh, very good. You know what I mean? Like, if you're interested in freedom, you must come along to the right, right? And even in relation to the right-wing think tanks, I do sometimes feel as though these discussions descend into, like, parlour games. It's a bit like, how much will it cost the NHS? You know, the NHS, it'll be, oh, God, don't be boring. I mean, even if the NHS has to spend a lot of money curing you if you've done something in a lifestyle way, well, so what? You know what I mean? Don't start doing it as a tax. You know, the tax, it'll cost that much more. It's just too instrumental. And I don't actually know that the figures always hold up in the way that people suggest. That's one thing. The second thing is I do get nervous about this idea of, as soon as you start talking about smoking, that you've immediately got to talk about drugs. I mean, and I completely agreed with Henry, by the way. Drugs is a hopeless term. I mean, what does that mean, right? But one of the reasons that it slightly irritates me is because I feel as though we then don't talk about the attacks on smoking. But one thing about it is that I think we should force the people at the moment who are having this conversation about an assault on tobacco to say, go on then, make smoking illegal. It's that way round to me. You don't have to have a, well, if you say this, what do you think about, should all of these drugs be made legal, right? I mean, that's, you know, that's an argument we have. But if they seriously say that it's killing people in this way and it says bad out, right, ban it then. Ban everything. Now, I know it sounds stupid, but it draws out more explicitly the authoritarian nature of what's going on. And I would force the government to be honest about it, because it's this kind of sleight of hand where they won't do that I think confuses people. I will finish, I think, by saying that we do have a chance. You know, this is actually, God, I didn't expect this to be quite so doomsaying. Do you know what I mean? It's like a sort of fatalistic, we're never going, right. Politics at the moment is really tough. And we're not even talking about, we're not even talking about the war, you know, in Israel and Gaza and so on, and the fact that society is completely torn itself apart in relation to that, and we're seeing explicit anti-Semitism on the streets, etc. So we're not even having that conversation. Politics at the moment is tough. A lot of people have been sold out in relation to Brexit. A lot of people feel very depressed about what happened during the lockdown period, the culture wars, what happened with Black Lives Matters, the fact that identity politics has turned blah, 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 right, it's tough. And as people who are interested in freedom and ourselves, take ourselves seriously and our agency and don't want to be stamped all over, you've got two choices, haven't you? Give up or fight back. And in order to fight back, you have to have decent arguments. And I think one of the things that's happened is we've got sloppy in the kind of arguments we use. We're not convincing people, and we've got to get better. So it's just up to us to improve. So see this as an inspiring call to self-improvement rather than slinking off into the doldrums and giving up and having a fag in the corner, right? That's not really the solution.
Right, let's hear some of these fight backs. Let's see some hands. Okay, yeah, you want to go ahead?
Yes, so in terms of the fight back that Claire was just mentioning, I was rather encouraged. I don't know if anyone else heard the news about the elections in Argentina yesterday, where we had the first libertarian elected as a head of government that anyone can think of. And I don't necessarily think that was because the Argentinians were converted to libertarianism in terms of, sort of reading Ludwig von Mises or whatever. I think it seemed to be more a reaction against things getting so bad that there were the sort of 200% inflation and the Baroness had got things doing really badly. So I wonder if that could be the source of hope. Rather, I mean, obviously, as a libertarian, I work hard to convert people to libertarianism, but I wonder if, as with prohibition of alcohol in the States in the 1920s, that it's more sort of the practicalities of things. That if we just see the state banning more and more things and speed up the crisis of statism, then eventually there's a reaction against it, and we saw that in Argentina yesterday.
Go ahead.
Thank you. I'm Ian Taylor. There's three things that have got thoughts buzzing around my head which may provoke further conversation. One, an awful lot of young people now, there has been, to some extent, a culture change. They don't smoke so much. I do wonder, from personal observation of some of them, whether that's because they've abandoned cigarettes and gone straight onto harder drugs, but...
alas, no.
But, however, point two, the incremental age ban. I foresee practical difficulties in enforcement. I can see a situation arising whereby, in order to enforce it, you won't be able to go into a shop and buy cigarettes or maybe even lots of other things without having to produce ID. Now, some years ago, I spent some time and effort with the No to ID organisation, and I didn't do that just to have these things brought in, shall we say, by the back door on any excuse. And it is any excuse, everything from voter fraud at elections and now having to prove your age to buy things. I don't like the idea. And, we'll leave it at those 2 points. Have a say on them.
Yeah.
Over the last 10 years of me following events around smoker reform, implementally the reform to bring around plain packaging smoking of cigarettes, I often found that the policy holder of that policy implementation was a avid smoker themselves. Do we often find that we are trying to talk to somebody who's trying to fight their own habits? Thank you.
Thank you. I wanted to thank everybody for their really interesting contributions this evening. The point was made earlier about this being a relatively kind of trivial issue that's representative of a wider principle. I think that's true, but do the government not seem to be realising that by abolishing effectively the legal distinction of adulthood, this is going to become a slippery slope for, say, Labour or any party in future, using that to justify a whole raft of things from, say, lowering the voting age to introducing further bans on this, that and the other, because once you get rid of that distinction of, okay, we agree in our society that 18 is a legal age of adulthood and we're getting rid of that by essentially saying it's a sliding scale that goes up indefinitely, does that not become a much wider principle that's defeated that then creates, opens the door to a whole raft of things being, either, say, voting ages being lowered or other age restrictions being raised for basically whatever political gain that party seeks so they can gain at any time. Thank you.
Thanks. Any other hands before we come to a close? Oh, sorry, yes. Pass the microphone along there, please.
If I could, I'd like to pick up on a really interesting point that was made a bit earlier. I forgot who made it. It was about socialised healthcare. Someone said earlier that, I can eat, drink, smoke, whatever I want, and if it doesn't hurt you, then it's not a problem. And it doesn't hurt me, except for, I suppose it does hurt my pockets as a taxpayer. I would be very interested to hear the panel's thoughts on socialised healthcare, where this takes us, how we can reach a compromise.
If you just pass it to the gentleman next to you then.
Yes, I think that putting a 19-year-old person in the same group with children and underage teenagers, where is the ethos in the law that it should say that tobacco can't be sold to underage people in exchange for money, and then after 50 years, somebody who is 30 years old will be in the same group, placed in the same group as underage people, and then that will make the same, and that is not where is the ethos in that law. And what should be maintained is that underage people, there's a reason why that law exists, and it's not to be manipulated. Thanks.
I remember during lockdown, a great way for the government to justify lockdown policies was to frame them in the stance of relieving pressure on the NHS. I'm just wondering if should the pro-smoking lobby take a similar approach in advocating for smoking as an easy route to cancer and a way of avoiding having to do the same sort of enthusiasm for euthanasia that we now see amongst our Canadian brethren.
Just a quick point on the tax issue. With tobacco taxes raising about £10 billion a year, once we achieve this smoke-free nation, where did the panel envisage that lost revenue coming from, given that neither party seems to be interested in cutting spending?
Sorry, as a retailer, I was just wondering in terms of, we're looking at jobs as well. I mean, if we're going to think about banning smoking, vaping, things like that, we're talking about employment. You've got massive industries that are employing thousands of people nationwide amongst retailers. There's a larger impact, obviously, to be faced here in regards to employment. What would be the contingency for lack of employment when it comes to these particular industries that involve banning smoking, vaping, and the likes?
I'm going to raise probably a very niche example, but as this age sliding scale progresses, what then happens when people migrate into the country, including those coming on boats or whatever means they're coming in, whereby they have become addicted to smoking in their home nation, and coming here are now prohibited from purchasing tobacco in this country.
Sunak tries to link the small boats issue to smoking. I'll kill him myself.
Just have a medal for that.
I heard socialism being mentioned as sort of a, what would you say, a taboo word, or a he who we do not speak of sort of thing. And I just wanted to try and bring sort of what a socialist probably would say in regard to that. I'll preface this by saying I'm not a socialist myself necessarily, but I come from a country that is probably more socialistic than here, I would assume, but it's sort of balanced.
Where are you from?
Denmark.
Ah.
Denmark. So it's a bit more socially democratic, you could say. Probably a bit more left-wing generally than the UK, I would assume. But I think if you were to ask a socialist and say, well, you guys are clearly limiting freedom, their counter-argument would probably be, no, we are actually doing the only thing that can counteract the true limiter of freedom, which would be massive capitalistic forces. And I could imagine that an argument for a ban against smoking would be, it's the only thing we can do to try and reduce the power and effect of massive tobacco companies that have got really a stronghold on people's psyches and all the advertising money in the world to influence and nudge people. And the only thing that can realistically fight against that is sort of a stronger government. I think that might be something of an argument you could make. Not that I support it, but just to be the devil's advocate here and try and bring up, because I suspect there's not a whole lot of socialists or ardent socialists in this room here necessarily. Just to bring that as a counterpoint, maybe.
Brilliant, thanks. Okay, panelists, you've had so many questions thrown at you. You can't answer them all. I mean, I was thinking about the fact that, I think it was Claire mentioned that people do, I don't think any of us here would sit and say there's nothing wrong with smoking, as, in terms of health or anything else. That we're not childish ourselves enough to try and argue that there is no downside to it, that people don't die of lung cancer, that all the rest of it doesn't happen. And, I think having given up briefly while I pregnant with my son. I'm very glad that I don't like smoking around him. I don't like people smoking around him. I think the social attitudes towards kids and fags is probably a good thing. You know, I like it that people can't light up in nurseries and things like that. But it's just not, but then, you know, maybe not in pubs. It's a different scenario. And I think, you know, do we need to be, I'm not sort of using the word flexible, but thinking about the way in which people's attitudes change can be an argument in our own arsenal for freedom and for choice. Because the pro-banners seem to think that the only reason why smoking habits have changed is because they started putting pictures of people with no larynx on the front of packets. And that's the only reason why people have stopped. You know, but then there are ways in which an anti-smoking attitude has been quite decimating for public life. For example, pubs shutting down. And, you know, every time I've ever done question time, no one smokes apart from the makeup artist. She's great. She always has a pack of Camel Blue in her bag. And it's, you know, in a situation in which it's already tense, it's incredibly tense. And you do feel like handing some of the politicians a cigarette under the table and say, I won't tell anyone, don't worry about it. Because there's this sort of idea that it's a thing that you shouldn't really do in a kind of not in a health way, but actually in a kind of a social way. That it would be bad to be seen to be doing that. I remember one time Mary Beard saying to me behind at the Hay Festival, can I please have a cigarette, but gripping onto my arm and saying, don't tell anyone that you gave me it, please, please. Please, I hope I don't get photographed with you smoking. And so,
and you respected her confidence.
Yes, I do. Like many things I respect about that woman. But you know, how can social attitudes, how can we work with social attitudes, actually? How can we, rather than saying, giving up on people or saying that people are just sort of lockdown followers, freedom haters, sheep, all the rest of it, that's what their side say. How can we, you know, approach our sort of public-spirited attitude towards our fellow citizens in a more sort of positive way? So, panellists, I'm going to, Simon, I'm going to leave you to the end so that you can close us. So, Henry, we've only got a few minutes and there are drinks promised afterwards, so don't go scuttling out, go get a glass in your hand afterwards. But Henry, can we just have a minute or two from you?
Sure. Again, there were absolutely tons of questions, and we honestly cannot remember them all, which is unfortunate. You know, the answer on retail is there's no safety net. Look at the pubs; they just let them shut. The socialism thing, yeah, that's false consciousness. You see a lot of this. That was Naomi Klein's No Logo. It's utterly uncompelling in terms of the actual evidence of the impact, the power of advertising. Advertising can move stuff around within smokers. It can move people between brands. It doesn't really persuade people to pick anything up. The election of ANCAP Man as president of Argentina, after saying Margaret Thatcher was his hero in a televised debate, I don't know. It'll be interesting to see whether or not he actually manages or does anything on smoking, because that's actually a big test, right? You've elected a man who really does believe this stuff. There's going to be all the usual institutional barriers to any kind of change. Does he actually get anything done? I don't know. In terms of, you know, trying to avoid being doom-laden, like I'm saying that because I'm amongst friends, right? Like if I was on a normal panel, I'd be going like, yeah, freedom's great, but you know, this is a safe space, I think, where we can confront hard truths. But the optimistic point is that you don't need to win everyone over to get things done. I think the thing that's always important to remember is there was never a polling majority for the smoking ban before it came in. Right up until the point when that came in, the majority of the public, when polled, are against it. And people got used to it very quickly, but the same is true in reverse. If you, in year one of a 5-year parliament, partially repealed the smoking ban, not completely, because you'll never do that now, but if you were like private members' clubs, wet-led pubs, a few other places, you did that in year one, by year 5, no one would care. The kind of people who don't want to be around people who are smoking would not be going to those places. They wouldn't encounter it on a week-to-week basis. So you can just act. And I think if there's any optimism that I can inject into this event, it's not the idea that there'll be a great sort of tidal wave surge of popular support for repealing smoking restrictions, because I don't think there will, but you don't need it. All you actually need is well-drafted legislation and the will to deliver it and a parliamentary majority. And in this country, you can actually get that. So focus on winning the internal battle, probably inside the Conservative Party. And the last thing I'll say is on socialised medicine, because we've touched on that quite a lot. And I think actually smoking is a really interesting argument against the idea of this of socialised medicine, because smoking is bad for the cracking down on smoking is bad for the NHS, right? If you take the absolutely bloodless, institutional utilitarian, how do we save the NHS as much money as possible? Let's order people's lives for the maximal convenience of the health service. The best thing many of them can do is pick up a packet of cigarettes, man. Like, Genuinely. So this is honestly an example of where the old school Puritan instinct behind the temperance movement and behind, a lot of this stuff is actually overriding costs to the NHS, which is normally such a powerful force in British politics. So that's what you're up against, really. And it would be the same even if we had a completely different healthcare system. But you can win. You just need to build a movement that's disciplined enough to get, presumably, some future Conservative government to just year one pass some of these things and then let them spend 5 years bedding in. Because ultimately, a lot of attitudes, as we've seen with the anti-smoking measures, a lot of public attitudes are just downstream of whatever the law is.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, I mean, look, smokers make up about 1/5 of the adult population, and there's not one of those adults that think that smoking is good for them. They are all fully aware of the fact that smoking is bad for their health, and, I really do think that this incremental increase in the age of sale of tobacco, this tobacco and vapes bill, really is Rishi Sunak's own vanity policy. There is absolutely no political will for it. It's only happening probably because Sunak doesn't want his own kids to smoke, and he thinks actually if I ban it for everyone, that'll be great. And again, this is part of a wider issue of paternalism and a wider issue where we actually accept government bans in all instances. And I mean, I put my hands up during the lockdowns. I was like, "Woo, let's save the NHS." I was younger, but but look, when people generally speaking, and this is I think a point that Henry made earlier, people will sort of accept these things and believe those things as soon as the government tell them that it's the truth. And when governments tell you that you need to stay at home to save the NHS, the majority of people in this country agreed and followed through. And when the government is saying that the best way to reach a smoke-free England by 2030 is to implement a blanket ban and incrementally increase the age of sale of tobacco, then of course we end up seeing most people agreeing with it. And this is the exact problem with government targets. Same thing with net zero. We're going to have reach net zero by 2030 or by 2050. Then as a result of that, you get this huge amalgamation of policies that follow that in order to try and achieve this target that the government set themselves. Same exact thing was trying to achieve smoke-free by 2030. Now, I want to make this as my last point. The way that we achieve a healthier society, the way in which we achieve a smoke-free society is by allowing adults to choose. It's the harm reduction model. We've seen the technology that vapes have allowed, the new development in batteries, the way in which nicotine is able to be delivered through to the lungs through vapor is at least 95% less harmful than smoking, if not more than that. And I think it's really important that we make the point, adults, when they are allowed to choose, often and have been making healthier choices.
There's a lot. I think actually, there could be a really productive and good discussion on socialised healthcare that goes beyond for or against the NHS. But now is not. We haven't got time to do it now. But I think that's it's even like something you could maybe
organise. Be next week.
Because I think it is worth pursuing or thinking about. I think there are some, maybe, people are attached to particular models, and that's on left and right, anti the socialised healthcare as well as the pro, that could do with shaking up a bit. But I suppose one of the things that I wouldn't want us to conclude is I don't want to look at you and think, oh, you eat the wrong food, you deserve if you get a heart attack, I don't care. That kind of society that says, oh, so you went out and played football in the dark, you know what I mean? You had a crash, serves you right, mate. Do you know what I mean? You did this. I would prefer a sense of solidarity, generally, in society, in which we make an agreement that if we don't have children, we're rather glad that other people do, and we're happy to have them have, society provide things for children. If our parents have died young and we haven't got elderly parents, we go, I don't give a damn about social, health care or social care for people with elderly parents. Personally, not good. That doesn't mean that we all have to have socialised, lovey-dovey socialist policies, right? But it does mean a certain responsibility. So I just don't like the way that smoking gets dragged into that in that particular way. I think you have to argue for people's freedom to do unhealthy things and not say, well, we pay enough tax, so you should look after us. I think it doesn't. That's not the point. I also thought it was interesting that somebody said, "What will happen?" What did they say? Where will we get the? Where will we replace all that tax income from? Which I think is a generational question, which means that we've given up on economic growth. I mean, basically, the only way that we can...
My generation will have to pay for it.
No. What your generation might have to do is have an industrial policy that actually builds and grows something occasionally, because the only way that anyone thinks of getting income now is either tax or not tax. And it's a ridiculous... It's like, we're stuck here, who can we nab this tax from? No, we need new industries, new growth, a whole new different attitude to economic development. That was a quip. I wanted to finish on something that Simon argues very persuasively in the pamphlet, and I think was what he was also talking about, which is about smoking for pleasure. And then people started getting into, well, does that mean, something about saying, I do this for pleasure. Immediately everyone goes, yes, well, people say that they take heroin for pleasure or cocaine for pleasure. We suddenly were into that territory. I think the reason why it's important to stick with what Simon was saying was because there's a whole medicalised version of this debate that says the only reason why anyone smokes is because they're addicted. And it's a way of medicalising this discussion that makes out that we haven't got the self-control and the agency to give up. Now, as a smoker trying to give up, let me tell you, I say that I'm addicted all the time because it's a convenient way of excusing the fact that I'm finding it hard. And that therefore I say I'm an addict and I'm kind of like, what can I do? And is it all right if I just have one now? And all the rest of it, right? But I think we have to be very careful about seeing ourselves as not able to overcome these things. And the converse of that is, I love smoking. I really, really enjoy smoking. And then I can make a choice that I'm not going to do it for a variety of reasons. But I don't want to say the only reason I smoke 30, 40 a day, as I did until recently, is because I'm so addicted, I'm so hapless that I can't control myself. It was because I really enjoyed doing it, and I chose to do it. In other words, we have to take responsibility for the lives that we lead and not constantly try and remove ourselves from that. So it is a bit of a dirty habit. I'm not lying. It's not great. It's probably doing you a lot of harm. Can be a bit unpleasant with the people next to you. If you're blowing smoke in their face, it certainly makes the walls go all a horrible yellow colour. Terrible for your skin. The tobacco companies are never going to employ me. All of that is true. But you can't beat it if you like smoking. It can be a great thing. And we shouldn't have to apologise all the time for choices we as grown-ups make. And that can be what we eat, who we live with, who we love, and all the rest of it. That's what being free means. So I do believe it is possible to win those arguments. Not just, I've made it sound like young people don't. And I completely agree with Henry. I'm not trying to be, don't want to be, what is it, Boris Johnson boosterish, go out there and win the arguments. I know it's tough. That's why Ellis set up doing Letters for Liberty. It was like, God, we're not very good at these arguments for liberty. We were going to have to think of some new. We can't just all keep quoting J.S. Mill all the time. You know what I mean? We've got to develop our own arguments. We've got to have more arguments. I genuinely think that we've got to work harder at winning the case of freedom. But God, I'd much prefer to be free than not to be. And I think it's an absolutely inspiring idea. We've been doing it for centuries. God, it's the basis on which human society has flourished. So we should be able in 2023 to come up with some good ideas for it myself. So I think we just, in that sense, we've got to at least say that's our task and not worry about Rishi Sunak or the mainstream politics, because I think it's a much bigger issue that we can take beyond either smoking or parliamentary politics myself.
Well, to be honest, I can't really follow that, so that makes things a bit difficult. I'm just going to pick up, somebody at the back talked about the pro-smoking lobby. I have to say, Forest has never been pro-smoking, going back to when it began in 1979. Never pro-smoking, never encouraged people to smoke. I've always seen this as part of a much, much bigger picture. It's never been just about smoking. It's about excessive intrusion by the state into our private lives. So it's not just smoking, it's about a whole range of things. And that's what this argument is all about. This is where we've got to fight back. And actually, this is why over the years, Forest has actually probably had more support from non-smokers than it has from smokers, because a lot of smokers have been they've been so harangued and harassed over many years that they actually don't want to defend their habit anymore. Many of them actually believe it is a dirty, disgusting habit, and the sooner they give up, the better. So actually, a lot of our support has come from non-smokers who I think do see the bigger picture. I don't make a habit of this, but I'm going to disagree with Reem, who said that every smoker knows it's not good for their health. That's actually not true, and a classic example is David Hockney, who has come to some of our events in the past. And David Hockney has always said, I mean, he's 86 now, and he's still puffing away, smokes, I think he says he smokes 30 during the day, another 10 at night. And he says smoking is good for his mental health. And he lived in America for many years, and he said a lot of his peer group, who are also now in their 70s and 80s, they didn't smoke, but they're all on drugs like Prozac. That's how they got through the day. And he says he smokes it as a form of some medication. But the point is, whether or not, it doesn't matter. We're individuals, and we all get through life in our own different ways. Some of us, you know, gorge on comfort food. I mean, there's all sorts of different ways. I probably drink too much. I certainly drink more than sort of 14 units of alcohol a week. But I would come back to what David Hockney says. I've quoted him in this book. I won't. The final two words in this booklet, which I won't repeat tonight, but one begins with F and the other one begins with O. And I would just finish by saying, what action do we take in terms of this legislation? Because obviously it's very difficult. Essentially, Rishi Sunak has already decided. There's a consultation taking place at the moment. I mean, there's a consultation, and yet Rishi Sunak put in the King's speech 10 days ago that he was introducing this legislation. So what the hell is the point of having a consultation if they've already made up their minds? I mean, doesn't that say something to you about democracy, as Claire was talking about earlier, and how government is run in this country? So, yeah, you could write to your MP. I mean, certainly MPs aren't going to do anything about it unless they hear from their constituents. But actually, Rishi Sunak has recently made an appointment, and let's actually make use of it. Bizarrely, he's appointed a Minister for Common Sense. I don't think that's an official title, but Esther McVey is the Minister for Common Sense. Esther McVey is married to Philip Davis. Now, I know we shouldn't judge people by their husbands and so on, but Philip Davis has actually always been very supportive of Forest, even though he doesn't smoke and doesn't like smoking, but he believes in individual liberty and so on. And I would suggest that if you're here tonight thinking, well, what can I do tomorrow to try and stop this? Well, odds are against us, but I would say, can you all write to Esther McVey, the Minister for Common Sense?
Very good.
She's the one person that we have at the cabinet table, and if she gets enough letters, then maybe she might raise the matter in cabinet. So that's my suggestion.
That's a good idea.
Well, thank you very much to Simon and to all the panellists and to Forrest for this evening. It's been a really great discussion. There are two things I just wanted to say. The first is that we talked a lot about the NHS tonight, understandably, and there's been some suggestion that there might be, that we'd be worth having another debate. Well, what are you doing on Saturday? Because the Academy of Ideas, Simon will forgive me for doing this, the Academy of Ideas is taking the Battle of Ideas Festival to Buxton, where there are lots of smokers. You might be surprised to hear. And we're having a debate called Is the NHS Fit for Purpose? Which is going to be looking at all of the questions raised today. We'll also be having a discussion on one of the letters on Liberty at the back on gambling, because this whole debate about public health and protection is also happening in the world of gambling. So come and find me or Claire, and come along with us to Buxton on Saturday, where we're taking over the Devonshire Dome. It's really beautiful, but we're having a Battle of Ideas festival there for a day full of debate and discussion. So join us there. The second thing is that, along with writing to Esther McVey, take one of these. Simon and Forrest are providing them as a gift to you guys at the back. Take one of them. They are intended, if you read the little essay at the front, they are intended, the Letters on Liberty, to sit in the tradition of radical pamphleteering. And we printed them in this neat little size so that they fit into your pockets. You can have them secreted about your place and give them to people. This is a conversation starter. The way that Simon goes through the history of smoking, testimonials from smokers and non-smokers, people like David Hockney who tell people to fuck off when they tell them to do something. This is a brilliant conversation starter and a brilliant weapon in your arsenal to fight for freedom. So take one, pass it to your friends, to your colleagues, slip it into that public health obsessives in tray and see what kind of face they make. So can we join me in thanking Simon for a really great discussion. Go get a drink.